Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
I was already 15 minutes late when I pulled into my parents' driveway, and not by accident. The house looked exactly the same as it had every birthday dinner before this one. Porch light on even though it was still light out, American flag fluttering from the post, and Mom's flower beds so painfully perfect they made my stomach turn. I stayed in the car for a moment, staring through the windshield, clutching the small, square gift box in my hand like it had a heartbeat. I'd wrapped it myself. Silver paper, black ribbon, simple, quiet, deadly. Inside, everything smelled like pot roast and lemon polish. I stepped through the front door just as Jason was finishing some dumb joke about his dog eating a sock. Everyone laughed like it was the highlight of their week. His wife Trish did her usual thing, gasped like she'd never heard anything funnier, touched his arm like she was still 16, and crushing on the quarterback. My mom lit up like a Christmas tree when she saw me, voice 2 octaves higher than usual, arms outstretched like we hadn't spoken 2 days ago on the phone. "Lena, sweetheart, there you are. We were starting to worry." That was bullshit. They'd never worried. They'd just started without me, like always. Dad stood at the head of the table, carving knife in hand, wearing that stupid beige sweater I swear he's had since Clinton was in office. His eyes skimmed me, then dropped back to the roast. "Glad you could make it." I sat down between Jason's 2 kids, who barely looked up from their iPads. Trish passed me a glass of wine like a reflex. Jason gave me a nod, his version of a hello. And for the next 30 minutes, we went through the usual performance. The comments about how time flies, the debate about gas prices, the predictable complaints about the town council and how they're all crooks. I chewed through it all, smiled when necessary, sipped my wine, played the part, until Dad tapped his fork on his water glass. The sound was sharp and clear and completely unnecessary, because the table was already quiet. Still, he tapped it like he was about to toast at a wedding. "I've got something to say," he announced, standing up straight and reaching into the side drawer near the china cabinet. I watched him pull out a thick envelope, manila worn at the edges. Everyone looked up. "I know today's about Lena," he said, not looking at me, "but I wanted to use the opportunity to do something I've been thinking about for a while." I felt it then, that buzz under my skin, like the air had dropped 5 degrees. "Jason," he continued, "you've always been dependable. You've taken care of things, looked out for this family, and I think it's time that was recognized." He slid the envelope across the table. Trish's eyes widened. Jason blinked, then gave a short laugh like he thought it was a joke. It wasn't. "That's the deed to the cabin," Dad said. "I'm transferring it to you. You're the kind of man who'll keep it in the family." No one moved. Mom sat there with her hands folded like a goddamn judge. Jason swallowed, took the envelope. Still no one looked at me. I couldn't even feel my hands at that point. They were just part of the table, just as decorative as the crystal salt shaker I wanted to hurl at someone's head. The cabin, our cabin, summers, winters, that one awful spring when a bear broke into the shed. That place wasn't a property, it was history. It was where I broke my arm jumping off the dock, where I caught my first trout, where I got drunk for the first time in high school, and Jason covered for me. And now it was his, because he was more responsible. Dad sat down like he'd just handed out a scholarship. Jason still hadn't said anything. His eyes kept darting to me, but he never actually met my gaze, not once. Trish clapped her hands and said something chirpy about, "What an honor," and Mom finally leaned over to touch my arm. "Lena, we just thought, well, you're always so busy with the business and you live so far from the lake." I smiled, big, bright, cold. "Of course," I said, "makes perfect sense." Dad exhaled like I'd just saved him from a tantrum. I guess that's what they expected. A scene, some melodrama. I'd been the difficult one since college, so it was on brand. But I wasn't interested in giving them a show. Not tonight, not with what I knew. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out the small babka, the one with the black ribbon. I placed it in front of my mother's salad plate. Her hand hovered over it. "What's this?" "A birthday gift," I said, "but open it later, when it's just the two of you." Jason looked curious for the first time all night. Trish leaned in a little, as if she could sense it wasn't earrings. "Should I be worried?" Dad asked, chuckling. "Probably," I said. And then I raised my glass. "To family," I said, "to decisions and to surprises." We clinked glasses, we smoked, we cut cake. But under all of it, I could feel it, the shift. The ground had tilted. They just hadn't noticed yet. But they would, because the box wasn't just a box. It was the match. And their perfect little world, it was already soaked in gasoline. The next morning, I woke up with the smell of pot roast still clinging to my hair and a tight knot in my stomach that refused to go away. No matter how many times I told myself I was fine, I wasn't fine. Not because of the cabin itself. To be honest, I hadn't stepped foot in that place in over 2 years, but because of what it meant, what it symbolized. That handoff last night wasn't just about a piece of lakeside property. It was about hierarchy, about being chosen, and about everything I had spent my entire life quietly resenting, but never daring to put into words until now. Jason had always been the golden boy, the one who never made waves, never raised his voice, never brought home anything less than an A-. He was the kid who color-coded his notes and helped Dad fix the gutter without being asked. He knew how to shake hands, when to shut up, and how to make people feel like they were being listened to, even when he didn't give a damn. People liked him. Hell, people loved him. I, on the other hand, had been the question mark. The unpredictable one, the mouthy one. I majored in art history of all things, then ran off to Chicago to start a design business that nobody thought would last a year, until it did. And then another, and another after that. But none of that mattered back home. Success, to my parents, wasn't measured in clients or contracts. It was measured in stability, in predictability, in how closely you could mimic the life they had mapped out for you in their heads. Jason followed the map. I drew my own damn route. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the untouched coffee in front of me, scrolling through old texts from my mom. Most of them were passive-aggressive nudges, reminders about calling more often, questions disguised as critiques. I saw on Facebook you dyed your hair again. That's a bold color for your complexion, or Jason says Trish is trying a new recipe for Thanksgiving. Maybe you'll finally like something. She always meant well, which somehow made it worse. Last night's dinner had been textbook. The looks, the comments, the way they had engineered the entire thing to be one big silent declaration. Jason is the safe bet, and you're not. It wasn't even anger I felt at that point. It was clarity, cold, sharp clarity that cut cleaner than rage ever could. And that clarity came with memories, dozens of them. I remembered the time Jason crashed Dad's car when he was 19. A total mess. Front bumper torn off, headlight smashed in, grill pushed back like a kicked-in mouth. He came home shaking, terrified, but Dad didn't yell. He patted Jason's shoulder and said, "You did the right thing coming home." 2 years later, I got a speeding ticket on the way to class, and Dad didn't speak to me for a week. I remembered Jason dropping out of pre-med to switch to engineering after 2 semesters, and how Mom baked a cake to celebrate following your passion. When I changed majors, she cried in her bedroom and said she didn't know how she'd explain it to her bridge group. And of course, I remembered the summer I spent working at the cabin with Dad, painting the deck and scrubbing mold from the bathroom tiles while Jason was helping a friend with a tech startup in California. When he showed up in August, they threw him a welcome party. I still had paint in my hair. People think favoritism in families is about big gestures. Extra money, more attention, bigger birthday gifts. But it isn't. It's in the small, constant calibration of tone and effort. The way they react to your choices, your mistakes, your triumphs. It's in who they worry about when someone is late coming home and who they forget to text on holidays. It's in being told, again and again, through tone and gesture and absence, that you are not quite what they hoped for, even if they never say the words out loud. After lunch, I drove across town to the framing shop. The guy behind the counter looked confused when I pulled the photo out of my envelope. A glossy print of me and Jason when we were kids, maybe 9 or 10 years old, sitting on the dock at the cabin with fishing poles across our knees. I told him to put it in a deep walnut frame, something that looked old and heavy. "It's a gift," I said. He nodded, didn't ask questions. On the drive back, my phone buzzed. A group text from Mom. "What a lovely night. So glad we could all be together. The cabin news was unexpected, I know, but we truly believe it's what's best. Love you both." I didn't reply. Jason sent a thumbs up. Later that night, as I sipped a second glass of wine and flipped through a dusty folder in my desk drawer, I found the envelope I'd almost forgotten I had. It wasn't thick, just a couple of printed emails, a bank notice, and a photo that didn't look like much to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. But I knew, and I remembered. 6 summers ago, I'd driven up to the cabin unannounced, wanting a weekend to myself. I was supposed to be in Italy that week, but my flight got canceled, and I figured the lake would do. When I got there, Jason's car was already parked in the drive. The lights were on. I remember walking in without knocking, expecting maybe he was just up for the weekend too. What I found was a half-dozen folders open on the dining room table, receipts scattered like leaves, and Jason on the phone saying something about transferring the asset before the next quarter. He hadn't heard me come in. I backed out before he saw me and drove back to town. I didn't ask questions. I didn't accuse. I just started saving things, quietly, cautiously, not because I thought I'd ever need them, but because something in my gut told me that one day, I just might. That day had come. And Mom still hadn't opened the box. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed with the ceiling fan spinning above me like a slow clock hand, the sheets twisted around my legs, and a familiar ache building behind my eyes. Not a headache exactly, but more like pressure. The kind that comes from thinking too hard, too long, about things you thought you'd buried years ago. The small box was still sitting on the kitchen counter, ribbon askew from my mother's fidgeting fingers. I knew they hadn't opened it yet. Mom had a flair for dramatics. She probably placed it on the mantel, intending to make a ritual of it later, with tea and whispered speculation. Maybe she'd already begun spinning stories about what was inside. A necklace, maybe. A pair of earrings. A last attempt to show them I could be generous in the face of being cast aside. It made me laugh, bitterly and quietly, in the dark. They didn't know what was coming. In the morning, I went through the drawers in my office, where the mess of my past was packed away in a half-labeled file box, buried under contracts, blueprints, and things I'd meant to throw away years ago. Dust clung to the corners of the folders like old guilt. The documents I'd kept weren't dramatic. There was no shocking letter, no anonymous note. What I had were details. Time-stamped receipts from that summer 6 years ago, bank records tied to a loan, a digital copy of a signed form with my father's signature, only he hadn't signed it. I remembered staring at that form when I first saw it and thinking, Jesus, he didn't even try to disguise it. Jason had copied our father's signature with the kind of confidence you only have when you truly believe no one will ever check. Back then, I hadn't known what to do with it. I didn't want to blow up the family. I told myself it wasn't my business, that maybe there was an explanation, that maybe Jason had permission and just didn't say anything. But deep down, I knew. Jason was smart, but he wasn't moral. He was the kind of man who made practical decisions and justified them with a grin. He didn't see rules, he saw suggestions. He was the kind of son who could look our parents in the eye after lying to their faces. And somehow, they still believed he was the stable one. What he had done, plain and simple, was use the cabin as collateral on a private real estate loan for a condo flip that had quietly tanked. He hadn't told our parents, of course. He'd forged Dad's signature and filed the paperwork through an online broker. It wasn't a huge loan, but it was enough to matter. And because the flip had failed, he'd scrambled to cover the payments. Based on what I'd seen last month, a couple of new invoices from an unknown account I stumbled across while doing a digital audit for a client, it looked like he'd managed to pay most of it off, but not all of it. The last few payments were late, sloppy, so much for responsible. I slipped the documents into a clean white envelope and added a copy of the original forged form for good measure. I had printed out the contractor's signed statement too, the guy Jason had hired for the flip job. I had tracked him down 2 years ago, mostly out of curiosity. He was more than happy to provide a written statement confirming that Jason had represented himself as the sole owner of the cabin property, claiming his father had already handed it down to him privately. A neat little lie, one told with such casual confidence, it probably didn't even register as wrong to Jason. I should have told our parents back then, but I hadn't. I didn't want to break anything more than what was already fractured. Instead, I did what I always did. I waited, I held on, and now was the time. I opened the small box, the one I'd wrapped in silver paper, and slid the flash drive inside. It wasn't flashy, just a matte black USB stick with a simple label, for your eyes only. Alongside it, I placed a copy of the contractor's signed affidavit, folded neatly into quarters, no theatrics, no note. I didn't need to explain it, not when it would explain itself. On impulse, I added something else. A photo from that summer, Jason standing in front of the cabin, arms slung casually over the porch post, wearing Dad's old fishing hat. He was grinning, proud of himself. You wouldn't know it to look at the photo, but that was the same weekend I'd come up early, uninvited, and found him knee-deep in paperwork and secret phone calls. The same weekend he looked me in the eye and said, "Let's keep this visit between us. Mom and Dad don't need to know we were both here." I'd smiled and agreed. I hadn't said anything, until now. That evening I texted my mother a reminder. "Don't forget to open the gift. You and Dad. Just the two of you." I knew they'd be curious, but cautious. They always were. Maybe they'd wait until the kids were in bed. Maybe Mom would insist on candles and classical music. Whatever their ritual, I imagined the moment clearly. Dad pulling out the flash drive with a frown, Mom asking what it was, then both of them sitting at the old family computer, side by side, like they used to when printing out Christmas letters. I pictured the silence as the files loaded, the widening of Dad's eyes, the narrowing of Mom's, the confusion, then the understanding, then the realization that the son they had trusted, defended, and handed the family cabin to, without hesitation, had not only lied to them, but had quietly gambled with the very thing they cherished most. I knew it would hurt them, and I knew they would hate me, at least for a while, for being the one to reveal it. But the truth wasn't a betrayal. The betrayal had already happened. I was just removing the blindfold. When my phone vibrated just before midnight, I didn't even check who it was. I knew. I poured myself another glass of wine, sat on my porch, and watched the stars with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. Some truths arrive loud, crashing through the front door like a storm. Others slip in quietly, one pixel at a time, and change everything. The first text came in at 2:13 in the morning, a strange hour, too late for anger and too early for clarity. It was from my mother, though she hadn't bothered with words. Just a question mark, that was all. A single mark of punctuation, dangling like a noose in the middle of an otherwise silent night. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to explain. I knew the contents of that flash drive were more eloquent than anything I could have said. And besides, if I'd learned anything over the past 40-some years of navigating this family's emotional swamp, it was that explanations only mattered when they came from the right mouths, and mine never had. I woke up late, made coffee with shaking hands, and waited. The next text arrived just after 8, this time from Dad. It read, "Come by the house. We need to talk." That was it. No please, no signature, just a blunt command. My stomach twisted, but not from guilt. Guilt was something I had buried years ago, along with every impulse to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was supposed to be. What I felt instead was something colder, anticipation laced with a kind of grim satisfaction. They had seen it, they knew now. The illusion had cracked, and there was no going back. When I pulled into the driveway, the curtains were already parted like they'd been waiting for me. Mom opened the door before I even knocked. Her lips pressed so tightly together they looked bloodless. Her eyes flicked to the small paper bag I was carrying. Inside, a cinnamon scone from the bakery near my house, still warm, still soft. A peace offering? Maybe. Or maybe just a habit I couldn't quite break. Trying to smooth things over even when I knew the smoothing was pointless. She didn't say hello. She just stepped aside and let me in. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, the same place he had handed my brother the deed, just 3 nights ago, as though it were a certificate of merit and not a loaded weapon. Now the envelope was gone. In its place was a stack of printed documents, the ones I had provided, of course, with a few new additions. I saw bank records, email printouts, even a copy of the notarized affidavit from the contractor. They had done their homework, or maybe they'd just been up all night chasing their own version of the truth. For a long minute, nobody said anything. Then Dad spoke. "Is this true?" The question was absurd, like asking whether fire was hot after you've already been burned by it. Still, I nodded. Mom sat down slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she were afraid she'd fall apart if she moved too fast. She reached for the affidavit, hands trembling ever so slightly, and read it again even though I could tell she had already memorized every word. When she looked up at me, her voice was flat. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" That at least was a question I had prepared for. "Because you wouldn't have believed me," I said evenly. "And because I didn't want to be the one to rip apart the fantasy you two have been clinging to for years." Dad flinched, just barely, but it was enough. That tiny shift in posture told me I had hit something raw. Mom's expression didn't change, but her voice turned sharper. "And you thought handing it to us like a birthday surprise was better? More poetic?" "I thought," I said, setting the scone bag on the counter, "that if I told you like a daughter, you'd hear it like a complaint. But if I showed you like a stranger, maybe you'd actually look at it." It was Dad's turn to speak, but the words came slow, pulled from somewhere deep and bruised. "He said you were exaggerating," he said. "When we called him last night, he said it was a misunderstanding, that he had every intention of talking to us about the loan, that he just forgot, that it was handled. Of course he did. And you believe that?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to the table, to the pages spread before him like pieces of a ruined shrine. I wanted to. That was probably the most honest thing he had said to me in years. For all their talk of responsibility, of values and tradition, what they really wanted was someone who would uphold the image, someone who didn't rock the boat, didn't challenge the narrative, didn't remind them that their perfect son had cracked spiderwebbing through his mask. Jason was easier. Jason was convenient. And for decades, that had been enough. Mom finally stood, walked over to the counter, and opened the bag. She took the scone, broke it in half, and held out a piece to Dad, who took it wordlessly. I watched them eat in silence, the kind of silence that weighs more than any argument. "He forged your signature," I said quietly. "You realize that, right?" Dad gave the smallest of nods. "We'll have to figure out what to do." "You already did something," I said. "You gave him the cabin." "That was before we knew." "No, it wasn't," I said. "You always knew. You just didn't want to see it." The moment stretched out between us, taut and ugly. Then Mom said, almost to herself, "Do you hate us?" I should have lied. I should have said no, but I didn't. "I don't hate you, I just finally see you." It wasn't revenge in the classic sense. No screaming, no slammed doors, but in a way, it was worse. I had held up the truth like a mirror, and now they had to sit there and look at it. The legacy they thought they were preserving, it had already been corrupted. All I'd done was peel back the wallpaper. As I left the house, I passed Jason on the sidewalk. He had that look, the one he used to wear after lying about something and knowing I'd caught him. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to spin another defense, but I didn't give him the chance. I kept walking. I didn't need an apology. He already gave me everything I needed. His silence. The weather had turned by the time I made the long drive back to the lake. And though it was technically still summer, there was already a sharpness in the wind that hinted at the cold to come. I rolled the windows down just far enough to let in the scent of pine and wet earth. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to take the long route along the ridge, the one that curved over the water and dropped into the wooded basin where the cabin sat like some stubborn relic from another time. I hadn't seen it in daylight since before Jason's real estate debacle, and even now, even knowing what I knew, the place still stirred something in me. It was almost funny how a single structure could hold so much history and still stand so indifferently while the people who built their lives around it collapsed into something smaller, something more fragile. When I pulled up, Dad was already on the porch, seated in the same rocking chair he used to fall asleep in every 4th of July after too many beers and too much sun. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched me the way a man might watch a storm in the distance, not because he wanted to run from it, but because he finally understood it was too big to ignore. I parked beside his truck, climbed the steps slowly, and waited for him to speak first, because I had said everything that needed saying. For a long time, he didn't speak at all. He just nodded toward the old wooden table beside him, and there, folded neatly and held in place by a stone paperweight, was the deed to the cabin. I knew the paper well, cream-colored, slightly thicker than standard copy stock, with a faded watermark running diagonally across it like the ghost of some bureaucratic signature. I didn't touch it. "We talked to a lawyer," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, raspier, like he'd been up late talking to no one. "He said we can reverse it if we want, but there'll be paperwork." There's always paperwork, I thought, but said nothing. "Your mother thinks we should just sell the place, cut our losses, let it all go. And what do you think?" He shifted in the chair, the wood creaking under him. "I think the cabin meant something before we tried to turn it into a prize. Now, I don't know what it is." I stared out over the water, remembering long August afternoons, when the lake shimmered like glass, and Jason and I used to take turns jumping off the dock, daring each other to do flips, pretending we were invincible. There had been a time, I was sure of it, when the place had meant nothing but freedom. But over the years, it had hardened, calcified into something weightier, something symbolic. And when a place starts meaning more than itself, it becomes dangerous. "I don't want the cabin," I said finally. Not out of spite, not out of anger, I just don't want it. He turned his head, surprised, though I could tell he was trying not to show it. "But you went through all this trouble to—" "I didn't dig all that up so I could inherit anything," I interrupted, more gently than I expected. "I did it because you handed my brother something sacred and called him responsible while pretending not to notice he'd already broken it. I did it because silence started to feel like consent." We sat there for another full minute, maybe longer, with nothing but the sound of the wind through the pines and the occasional screech of a distant bird. There was no traffic, no buzz of lawnmowers or kids playing nearby. Just quiet, the kind that either heals you or haunts you, depending on what you're willing to face. He picked up the deed and held it out to me, not like a peace offering, but more like an attempt to pass off a burden. I shook my head. "You still think this is about ownership?" I said. "It's not. It's about accountability." Behind me, the screen door creaked open and my mother appeared, holding 2 coffee mugs like we were about to share some ordinary morning moment. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was bare, older somehow, more worn than I remembered. She handed me a cup and said nothing, just sat on the step with the kind of posture that said she hadn't slept. I took a sip. It was bitter. "I don't hate him," she said after a long silence. "Your brother." "Neither do I. He made a mistake." "No," I said. "He made a decision. A mistake is something you trip into. This was a plan." Dad didn't argue. He just stared at the lake like it might offer some version of forgiveness he couldn't find in our faces. Eventually, I stood and walked down toward the dock, my feet crunching on gravel and old leaves. The boards creaked beneath my weight, familiar and fragile. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. The one of Jason and me as kids. Fishing rods in hand, faces smudged with dirt and sunburn. I stared at it for a long moment before setting it down on the edge of the dock and watching the breeze lift it, fluttering once, then twice, before it slid into the water and floated there like a question without an answer. I didn't wait to see if it sank. As I turned to leave, my mother called after me, "So what now?" And I stopped, because it was the first time I'd heard her voice tremble. "Now," I said without looking back, "you decide whether you want to rebuild what mattered or keep pretending it never cracked." I didn't offer to stay for lunch. I didn't say I'd come back soon. I just walked to my car, started the engine, and left the cabin behind. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with something quieter. The kind of closure you only get when you finally stop waiting for people to admit they were wrong. Some families break in a moment, shattered by a single event. Ours didn't. Ours broke over years, quiet, consistent, deliberate. And I didn't cause the fracture. I just held up the mirror. And sometimes, the truth doesn't fix a damn thing. It just makes sure no one can pretend anymore.